Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, breaking down Chris Finch's interview with Redick last week. There were three main things that Chris Finch talked about that he wants to see the Timberwolves improve this year, specific to their offense. I want to break them down in a bit more detail today and, kind of read between the lines what Chris Finch might have been trying to say, and also where the numbers back him up, what happened to the Wolves offense this last year in a disappointing offensive season. It's all coming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by Jase Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jase case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jasemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy hump day. Hopefully you're having a fantastic week so far. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find this one. You can also watch, along with all the other Minnesota Locked On podcasts, over at the Locked On Sports Minnesota app, which you can find on either Roku or Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CK. All right, so late last week, I think it was last Thursday, Chris Finch was the guest on the Old Man and the Three podcast. That's the JJ Redick pod. And it was a really good conversation. We talked a little bit about it late last week and also mentioned it on Monday's show. So what I want to do is take, in my mind, there were three kind of main things that Chris Finch talked about specific to last year / this year's Timberwolves teams, right? Like the conversation was wide ranging. They talked a lot about Redick's time playing for Finch in New Orleans. They talked about other players in the league, et cetera. Other, Finch's background, coaching overseas, et cetera, coaching the G League, his relationship with all the Rockets guys, Morey and Hinkie and Rosas and everybody that got him into, stateside to coach in the G League and the NBA. Great conversation. But specific to the Wolves, I had three main takeaways. And we could really title this podcast, Chris Finch's 3 things to fix the Timberwolves offense this season. I don't know if you asked him 3. I don't know if these are like his 1, 2, and 3, but they make a lot of sense. And they're 3 of the main points he made. So let's dive into it. I want to start actually with offensive rebounding. And I talk a lot on this podcast over the last year. I did talk over the last year a lot about rebounding in general and specifically defensive rebounding, right? Because the Timberwolves have been a bad defensive rebounding team for seemingly since Kevin Garnett was on this team the first time around. So, we're talking 15 years, something like that. I'm pretty confident there's probably a couple Kevin Love years. They were middle of the pack defensive rebounding, but the Wolves have been a bad defensive rebounding team for a very long time. Like last year or 2 years ago, they were 27th in defensive rebounding rate. Last year, they were 26th. They've been bottom 5 for a long time, right? But I want to focus on offensive rebounding because while defensive rebounding is I know it is by name, it literally is part of defense. And this is just a real quick aside. If I haven't said this in a while. So if you're a new listener to the podcast, when I rant and rave about defensive rebounding, the Timberwolves problems there, I always like to point out that rebounding gets shortchanged by people a lot of the time as being a key part of defense, right? Because how is the only way you can get the ball back? What's the only way you can get the ball back from the opposition? Well, they score, they turn it over, or you get a defensive rebound. That's the only way you're going to get the ball back. Like literally the only ways. So if they're missing a shot, you've got to get the rebound. So it inherently is part of defense. The Timberwolves have been a bad defensive team forever. They obviously cleaned that up quite a bit last year. Yes, Rudy Gobert had a lot to do with it. So did Jaden McDaniels. So did Chris Finch and the coaching staff. So they were a top 10 defense. Defensive rebounding was still bad. And a couple years ago, the defense was improved despite the defensive rebounding. But that was one of my things that I harped on, especially in the 21-22 season. Now it's the offense, right? The script kind of flipped. The offense last year was bottom 10 all season. It finished, depending on where you look, 23rd to 25th, somewhere in that range in terms of offensive rating, offensive efficiency. And what was one of the biggest issues? Offensive rebounding. 2 years ago, in the 21-22 season, the Timberwolves finished 8th in offensive rating, according to Basketball Reference. That's their measure, or that's where Basketball Reference had the Wolves in terms of offensive rating 2 years ago, or year before last, 21-22, the Memphis playoff series year. The Timberwolves were 8th in offensive rating, according to Basketball Reference. They were also 7th in offensive rebound rate. They shot a ton of threes. They shot more threes. They got to the line more, and they got more offensive rebounds. So we could cherry pick any one of those to talk about. We will talk about three-point shooting later. As you'll see if you're watching YouTube, you can see what the three things are on the side of your screen there. We will talk about some three-point shooting later, specific to a couple of guys. But offensive rebounding is something that, frankly, should be the easiest thing to fix, because in a lot of ways, it's about awareness and positioning, and also just simply working harder. And I know that sounds like I'm coaching a middle school basketball team, but like that's such a big part of rebounding, right? It's the effort level, working harder. And then also anticipation, being in the right place at the right time, floor balance, et cetera. Like understanding all of those things, that all plays into it. But putting this very, very simply, look at the personnel the Timberwolves lost from the 21-22 season to the 22-23 season. Yes, they gained Rudy Gobert, who has been literally the NBA's best defensive rebounder a couple years ago, and is just good on the glass in general. But they lost Jared Vanderbilt, Josh Okogie, and Patrick Beverley. And you might be saying to yourself, what are you talking about? Nobody missed Josh Okogie and Patrick Beverley for their rebounding. Well, true. In a vacuum, like if you're talking what are those guys' strengths, probably you're not talking about rebounding at all, right? But for their roles, for their position, they were good. And they were replaced with guys who were not effective this last year. Let's start with Vanderbilt. Jared Vanderbilt 2 years ago had a 12% offensive rebound rate, which is incredible. The best on the team, if you take out Nate Knight, who only played in 37 games that year. Better than Naz Reid, better than Cat. Best on the team. The next best offensive rebound rate after Vando, Naz Reid, and Karl-Anthony Towns was Josh Okogie with a 5.9% offensive rebound rate in the 21-22 season. That was a 1.5 better than Jade McDaniels. It was better than, far better than Anthony Edwards, almost 3 times what Anthony Edwards' offensive rebound rate was. Almost 4 times what Taurean Prince's offensive rebound rate was. 6 times what D'Angelo Russell's offensive rebound rate was in 21-22. So Josh Okogie had the 4th best offensive rebound rate on the entire team. So you're missing your number 1 and number 4 offensive rebounders from that year. And oh wait, Patrick Beverley was tied for 5th with Jade McDaniels at 4.4%. Patrick Beverley was your 5th best offensive rebounder by rate 2 years ago. And who did the Timberwolves replace them with? Well, loosely, I mean, you could say Kyle Anderson replaced the Vanderbilt role, right? He ended up starting, like literally Towns or Gobert did in the starting lineup. But in terms of minutes allocation, and obviously Kyle Anderson started a bunch at the 4 after the Cat injury anyway. But Kyle Anderson replaced Vando. Now, Kyle Anderson had the ball in his hands a lot more. He was initiating. He was distributing a lot more than Jared Vanderbilt ever did. So there's a big reason for this. But like, it is what it is, right? Because you improve in one area, you might be taken away from another. Kyle Anderson had a 3.8% offensive rebound rate this season. That's a really low offensive rebound rate. 3.8% from a guy who played primarily the 4 this season. So you replace your best, a 12% offensive rebound rate, with a 3.8% from Kyle Anderson. You replace Josh Okogie's minutes, again, not apples to apples, but loosely with Jalen Noel for most of the season. That was almost cut in half, from 5.9% for Josh Okogie to 3.3% for Jalen Noel. You replace Patrick Beverley's minutes with, early on, it was Jordan McLaughlin. Then it ended up being actually quite a bit of Noel, in that slot off the bench. Bryn Forbes at times early in the season, Nikhil Alexander-Walker. Those guys all have minuscule offensive rebound. Austin Rivers had an offensive rebound rate of 0.6% this season in 52 games, below 1%. Taurean Prince, by the way, 1.4%. I harped on rebounding being on both ends of the floor being a big problem for Prince this year. One of the areas the Wolves might clean up a little bit by replacing him. Bryn Forbes, 1.7%. Jordan McLaughlin, 2.5%. Not horrible for a point guard, but not great. It's not Patrick Beverley's 4.4, right? So the point here is those incremental changes matter. And no, the Timberwolves weren't a bad offensive rebounding team simply because they let Josh Okogie and Patrick Beverley go. But by replacing them with guys that were below average, replacing good offensive rebounders with guys who are below average, that affects your offense. Offensive rebounding affects your offense. The more possessions you get, like, again, by definition, like, it seems silly to kind of reiterate these definitions, but defensive rebounding ends a possession. Offensive rebounding gives you another possession, right? That's one of the key measures of a successful offense is a successful team is how many possessions are you generating. It's one of the reasons why teams started to play faster, because the more possessions you get, the more chances you have to shoot, right? The more threes you shoot, the higher, the more threes you're going to make, right? Generally speaking, that's how it's pretty simple math. So offensive rebounding is really important to offenses. It's one of the reasons why the Timberwolves went from a top 10 offense to a bottom 7 or 8 offense, depending on where you're looking, last season. And it's not because Josh Okogie was an offensive ace or Patrick Beverley was, the key to the Timberwolves bench last year on the offensive end of the floor. It's because you're replacing, or even Vando, right? It's not like Vando was scoring a bunch, but you're replacing 3 capable, above average, very good offensive rebounders with 3 essentially below average offensive rebounders. And in the grand scheme of things, now, some of this is also scheme. And Finch said this on the podcast, right? It's scheme, it's spacing, it's understanding the floor balance that I mentioned earlier, and it's also simply effort. But the easiest way to kind of hash this out is by pointing out the 3 guys that are gone, the 3 guys that replace them. Again, not apples to apples, but a pretty good picture of what happened last year, and an area that Chris Finch identified in this interview with JJ Redick, the Timberwolves need to improve. And I think it's entirely doable. We could talk about some of the personnel changes the Wolves are making going into next year. By the way, playing even bigger, Kyle Anderson will play more at the 3 because of the Naz Reid signing. Naz Reid, by the way, had a dip in offensive rebounding himself last season. He went from 8.8% 2 years ago to 6.6%. Karl-Anthony Towns had the worst offensive rebounding season of his career by far last season. Now, obviously, I should have mentioned this earlier. Part of the reason there was that dip for the team is that Cat played 50 less games than he did the year prior, right? Or 45 less games or whatever. But Karl-Anthony Towns himself, including last year, has a career offensive rebound rate of 9.5%, and he was 5.7% last year. He had never been below 8%, 8.1% in his career offensive rebound rate. He dipped to 5.7% last year. So obviously culpable there as well. We know he only played 29 games, but those are all the reasons why that happened. And offensive rebounding and the lack of offensive rebounding is a huge reason why the Timberwolves offense dipped to bottom, the bottom tier of the NBA last season. I want to get to next, as you'll see again, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see there on the side of your screen. I want to talk about Anthony Edwards catch and shoot threes. This was something Chris Finch honed in on a bit on the Redick podcast. So we'll do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at Jase Medical. Jase Medical has the Jase case at jasemedical.com. It provides 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use. All it takes to get a Jase case is you fill out a simple online form, and in some cases, you might jump on a quick call with one of their board-certified physicians and get ongoing care from their physicians on any treatment-related questions, doctor-created and doctor-recommended. Simply put, Jase Medical wants to make sure that you don't get caught unprepared. Everyone should be empowered to care for themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected. I mean, that could be a natural disaster. It could be getting stranded. We're getting into the fall and winter travel season. If you're traveling for holidays, it makes a lot of sense to have a Jase case, so you're ready to go when something happens that you otherwise may not be prepared for. Jase will handle everything from online evaluation to licensed pharmacy medication delivery and ongoing consultation and care. I just signed up actually yesterday, and I'm expecting my Jase case to arrive at any moment. There's plenty of examples out there of times when Jase Medical has come through. Like Frank, for instance, said a real customer that said, it's easy as 1, 2, 3, and just in time. I received our package the same day I got a sinus infection. My doctor was out of town, no appointments for days. Thank goodness it arrived. Again, storms, shortages, pandemics, currently supply chain issues, reliance on China, etc. We need to be prepared now more than ever. You go online, you fill out a form, and you get a prescription, life-saving medications right to your door. The Jase case gives you peace of mind, so you're not just hoping you have access to medication in an emergency. Save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jase Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using my code LOCKEDON at checkout on jasemedical.com. Again, my code LOCKEDON will get you an additional $20 off at jasemedical.com. That's Jase, Jase medical.com. sportsbook.com. Big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, we are wrapping up the offseason portion, I guess, of Locked On Wolves already. Man, it's crazy. Training camp's just a couple of weeks away. Preseason starts in like 3-ish, I guess maybe 4 weeks. So we're going back to daily shows next week. We're going to get into player previews here shortly. It's getting real. So be sure to tune back in. We'll have a show Friday and then again back to daily 5 days a week starting next week on Monday. All right. Next up on the list here today, related to Chris Finch, his topics with JJ Redick last week on the Old Man in the Three podcast, is more Ant catch and shoot threes. And this was part of, I kind of picked this out of a bigger conversation about Ant, and also JJ Redick talked a bit about himself and how he was told by coaches, by Finch and Alvin Gentry back a few years ago in New Orleans when Finch was on Gentry's staff, hey, stop shooting so many mid-range twos, don't pump fake and dribble into a long two, pump fake and sidestep into basically escape dribble into a what should be an open three. And Redick was saying, I'm a great long range two shooter. And he said this maybe a little more colorfully than I'm going to say it now. He's like, hey, I can shoot twos at a high clip, which is true, but you have to be a really, really good mid-range shooter in order to make that a better shot than a mostly open three-pointer, especially when you're as good of a three-point shooter as JJ Redick. So Finch talked a bit about Anthony Edwards and said that he just in general needs to shoot more threes. The shot selection, as we've talked about on this show, needs to improve a little bit. And he mentioned, I don't remember his exact words, this isn't verbatim, but Finch said something about how Anthony Edwards is a great catch and shoot three-point shooter, and he just needs to do more of it because he's so good at it. And he is. We've talked about this on the show many times before. As a rookie, Ant was like 34% catch and shoot threes, which is obviously below league average. But the last 2 seasons, he's been over 41%. 2 years ago, in 21-22, Ant was 41.3% on catch and shoot threes. Last season, he was 41.7%. And if you look at the overall, at the percentiles in the NBA, 41.7%, according to B-Ball Index, is 84th percentile. They grade that out as an A-. So 84th percentile league-wide at catch and shoot threes. He's a well above average catch and shoot three-point shooter. Yes, his overall percentage was around 37. It was like 36.9%, which is, I think, last year slightly below league average, if I'm not mistaken. Right near there, right? But he's well above average in terms of catch and shoot three-pointers. 41.7% is 84th percentile. And pretty much every other type of three-point shot that Ant shoots is pretty league average. This is, so again, according to B-Ball Index, he's 37% overall, which is 71st percentile, 34%, I'm rounding up a little bit, 34% on pull-up threes, which Ant loves to shoot in transition, 67th percentile. That's a B, according to B-Ball Index. Above the break threes, 36%, 72nd percentile. Corner threes, 43.3%. Don't get too excited. That's 75th percentile, which is maybe a little above average. They call that a B+. But it's not a phenomenal number, right? Now, of course, most corner threes, almost all corner threes are going to be catch and shoot. But in general, Ant's an 84% catch and shoot three-point shooter. 84th percentile. 84% would be really good, wouldn't it? He's 42% catch and shoot, 41.7% to be exact. 84th percentile league-wide catch and shoot three-point shooter. So Chris Finch was absolutely onto something. That's 2 years in a row now where he's been north of 41% from outside the arc. He continues in catch and shoot outside the arc. He continues to improve in that area. And last year, about a third of his three-point attempts were catch and shoot, according to B-Ball Index. Nearly 2/3 were pull-up threes. And also, by the way, only 10% of Ant's three-point attempts were from the corners. 90% came from above the break, according to B-Ball Index, which, by the way, B-Ball Index even says they gave him a minus 0.97 for three-point shot quality. And their definition for that is an overall measure of shot quality combining shot location, openness, and type. That's an F. 11th percentile for three-point shot quality. And with all of that, Anthony Edwards was 84th percentile catch and shoot threes and somewhere between 67 and 75th percentile everywhere else. And they even give him, because of the difficulty of his shots, in part, or due in large part to the difficulty of the shots, Basketball Index gives him an A for three-point shot making, an A+ for three-point shot creation, and an A+ for perimeter shooting, because he's taking the most difficult shots he possibly could, and he's still making them at a league average or better clip. So to Chris Finch's point, Anthony Edwards, please shoot more catch and shoot threes. Be more decisive when you catch the ball. On the catch, let it fly. Shoot threes. It's going to be easier than the pull-up in transition. It's going to be easier than a step back. It's going to be easier than, I guess those are the main ways he's generating non-catch and shoot threes, right? Shoot the basketball when you get it on the perimeter, or be decisive and drive to the basket. And again, he improved with that last year. It wasn't horrible, but there's continued room for improvement there. And the sky, I say this almost every show, is very literally the limit for Anthony Edwards. His talent is so immense. The fact that we're talking about him taking some of the most, 11 percentile in shot quality from threes, but he grades out it as an A or an A plus in terms of 3-point shot making, shot creation, perimeter shooting overall, because he's such a talented player that, as Finch said casually, I'm pleading more than Chris Finch was right now. Or I'm pleading right now more than Finch was on that podcast. Just shoot those easy catch and shoot threes, and you're going to be so much more effective and efficient as an offensive player. And Finch goes on to talk about shot selection in general. And really, Anton actually, like, his mid-range attempts were up a little bit last year, but for the most part, the shot selection continued to improve. The consistency just wasn't quite there. And it's like, occasionally late game, heat check situations, which happen maybe more than they should, late quarter, late clock situations, and forcing up these threes. But if he just took out one or two of those a game and added in one or two catch and shoot threes, not pull-up threes, like, his overall 3-point shooting percentage is going to be north of 38, 39%. And in general, he'll be so much more efficient as a player. And I would say this, based on that interview with JJ Redick, this is one of Chris Finch's main goals for this year for the Timberwolves offense, is to get Anthony Edwards more catch and shoot 3-point opportunities, which will increase his efficiency and the overall effectiveness and efficiency of the Timberwolves offense. Pair that with some offensive rebounding, some improvement in that area, and this offense immediately becomes far more dangerous than what we saw last year. One more thing to get to, and a little bit of Karl-Anthony Towns in this conversation as well. So we'll do that here next to close out the show. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. Get ready for the NFL season with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Now is the best time to join FanDuel. The app is easy to use. You can bet on everything from spreads to player props and more. Of course, it's football season. That is college football Saturday, NFL Sunday this week. There's college football games now Thursday and Friday night. There's plenty to bet on over at FanDuel. Baseball, the pennant race, the Twins are in it. Lots of fun, exciting stuff over the next 3 weeks leading into playoff baseball. Again, now's the absolute best time to join FanDuel. All customers who bet $5 get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV, plus $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and kick off the NFL season with an offer you won't want to miss. FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. All right, closing the show here today with another Chris Finch item from the conversation with JJ Redick, specific to the Timberwolves offense as a whole. And Finch talked about the need for the team to have a bit more offensive structure this year. And you'll recall, I think it was even 2 years ago, but certainly last year, Finch talked about the offensive philosophy being a bit more free-flowing. The kind of the way he liked to describe it was putting bumpers up on the offense and allowing the players to kind of move within those bumpers and create their own scoring opportunities. And not as many, it wasn't a Ryan Saunders rigid, play sets in a massive playbook like Ryan and Flip Saunders and even Tom Thibodeau at times. More of a free-flowing offense with bumpers. Well, Finch even kind of lamented this at times last year, but saying that the Wolves needed a bit more structure. Now, of course, that's going to be the case when you had, D'Angelo Russell running the offense. You have a young 21-year-old Anthony Edwards running the offense. Now you've got Mike Conley, so you've got a bit more of a steady hand kind of helping the offensive flow. But Finch acknowledged in this conversation with JJ Redick that, yes, there needs to be a bit more structure. And maybe the primary reason is, and he says this, is Gobert and Cat on the floor together. You need to kind of have a plan for where those guys are going to go and win, so they're not getting in each other's way. And a huge part of this is they just hadn't played together. So I think Rudy probably didn't fully understand how much Cat wanted to be driving from the perimeter in face-up situations. Cat didn't really understand that Rudy's either like in pick and roll or he's lingering near the rim ready for an offensive rebound or a drop-off pass from a point guard or from a guard or a wing. And the spacing was just not good at times. And I had said coming into the season last year, I didn't think it would be that big of a deal because Cat can space the floor, right? Like you're just kind of shuffling where your shooters are. You still have 4 or 5 guys that can shoot. But remember, both Cat and Ant love to drive to the basket. And if you end up with a guy driving, Rudy lingering in the dunker spot or closer to the rim, and a cutter, you've got 3 guys clogged in the paint and only 2 guys spacing. And that's just not the right formula, right? So Finch talked about needing a bit more spacing and having more structures to the offense. He also talked a little bit about Karl-Anthony Towns' role and how Cat made more sacrifices than anybody else last year and how rare it is for all NBA players who Cat's done it twice now. He's been an all NBA player to be asked to basically change their position and their overall game to accommodate an acquisition by the team. And Finch he mentioned like, hey, I'm again paraphrasing here, but I don't, I didn't want to ask Cat to stand in the corner and just shoot threes. And then he mentioned kind of as an aside, like, I would like to see his 3-point rate go up. Like he could stand to shoot more threes. I talked about last fall, it was early in the season. I think it was before the Towns injury, maybe after the first, call it 8 or 9 games, like right before the injury, when the Timberwolves offense was struggling. I remember doing a show where I spent a significant chunk of the show talking about how like, hey, Towns could be a souped up Bojan Bogdanovic. This is, of course, well before Mike Conley's on the Timberwolves. Basically, copy and paste what the Jazz did to have the league's most efficient offense a couple of years prior and run the offense. Anthony Edwards in the Donovan Mitchell role, Mike Conley and currently in the Mike Conley role, Karl-Anthony Towns in the Bogdanovic role, and Gobert in the Gobert role, right? Like now you literally have 2 of those guys, and Edwards and Mitchell, there's a lot of similarities with how they play. And I would argue that, Ant is, I prefer Ant's playing style in the ceiling. I'm not at all saying he's better than Donovan Mitchell today in September of 2023, but he could be very soon. All that to say, like, that was kind of my thought. Now, Bogdanovic, a lot of what he did in Utah, not the only thing, but a lot of what he did was he hung out in the corner and he just crushed corner threes at like 47, 48%, just a ridiculous percent. I wanted that to be Cat's role. And then obviously you could play off of that, right? Like Cat could do so much more than Bogdanovic. Bogdanovic is a really talented offensive player. But I thought that was kind of a good baseline for what Cat could do in this offense. Now, Finch pretty much said that's not what I want to do. And I 100%, like, I think actually my argument was when Rudy's off the floor, Cat should be facing up from the perimeter and shooting over smaller bigs, shooting over 4s, taking 5s off the dribble to the basket, dropping them off at the rim and getting an and one, right? Like, and then when Rudy's on the floor, run pick and roll with Ant and Rudy, let Ant attack, dump it off to Rudy, and Cat stands in the corner and hits threes at a 47% clip. Like, that's oversimplifying it, but I think that might be the best of both worlds. And then if Ant and Rudy are off the floor, it's Cat's show, 100%. Like, Cat gets every possession. Just do it. And if you have Ant and Cat on the floor, you can do a little bit of both. You could do a little bit of Ant attacking, do a 5-out situation. You could do pick and roll with Cat. If Rudy's on the floor with Ant, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with having Karl-Anthony Towns play that ancillary role for, I know it's a big chunk of the game that they're going to play together, but if he's still your second option, essentially at that point, and he's your number one option for every moment that those other guys aren't both on the floor together. So I think like I'm building out a little bit further beyond what Finch said. Finch just said we need more structure and we need to get Cat more 3-point opportunities. His 3-point rate actually last year was the highest it had been since the 1920, the COVID shortened season when he also was hurt before COVID. It was actually the second highest 3-point rate of his career this year, which I thought was interesting. That surprised me a little bit. But it also was his worst 3-point shooting year since his rookie season. He shot just 36.6% from 3 last year. I don't think anyone thinks he's a 36% 3-point shooter. He's career 39.5% now. He is a 40% 3-point shooter. So getting Cat, call it 8 attempts per game, which is roughly where he was last year, is completely reasonable. Or sorry, not 8 attempts per game. I was looking at the per 100 possessions. What was he per game? Like 6 attempts per game? Yeah, 5.7% attempts per game. I think getting him 6 to 7 is completely reasonable. 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, I guess now, he was over 6 attempts per game. 4 years ago, he was 8 attempts per game. So I think somewhere in that 6 to 7, 8's maybe a lot in the current structure of the offense, but I mean, more is better, right? Like I'm not saying it's a lot because I don't want him to shoot 8 threes a game. I just would be surprised if he gets that number. But all that to say, there's room for growth there. You can get Cap more 3-point opportunities and still continue to improve the efficiency and the overall flow of this offense. That's all completely doable. So to Finch's point, more 3-point opportunities for Karl-Anthony Towns, more structure to the offense could actually lead to a more efficient, more kind of grease the wheels for a more efficient offense. I think that's completely within the realm. So Finch's 3 things that I'm building out further: more 3-point opportunities for Karl-Anthony Towns and structure in the offense. That's one together. More catch and shoot threes for Anthony Edwards, and better offensive rebounding as a team, which is something that personnel will impact, effort will impact, scheme will impact. Just playing harder, right? Like all of those things together can help improve this Timberwolves offense this year. What was a really disappointing offensive season last year, some would say an offensive offensive season for the Wolves. There's a lot of room to grow for the Timberwolves on offense in the coming season. All right, that's all we got for you today. We'll be back again on Friday. And then, of course, next week we go back to 5 shows Monday through Friday, starting on Monday the 18th. I cannot wait to get this whole thing rolling as we get closer to the season. A big thank you to those that do make this show your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can find this show. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on Twitter or X at Beecken, and also at Locked On T-Wolves. Don't forget the T. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. The Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.